So yeah, welcome to our panel to celebrate Rare Diseases Day. That's going to happen in 2 days. Here today we have Sophie Stone. She's an academic at the University of Edinburgh. She focuses on science and technology studies, and she's currently working on the social and political dimensions of her health-related life sciences and technologies, with a particular engineering biology. She's currently a research fellow working on the engineering biology for Advanced Therapeutics Mission Hub, where work explores the social, political, and ethical dimensions of advanced therapeutics, including cell and gene therapies, and supports the capacity building for responsible research and innovation. Our other speaker is Marina Leroy. She's a scientific communications manager at the FH European Foundation. She holds a PhD in biology from the University of Geneva and brings over a decade of experience at the intersection of science, communication, and strategy. Her work focuses on translating complex biomedical research into clear, meaningful narratives for diverse audiences, including healthcare professionals, patients, and general public. She's also committed to advancing evidence-based communication and strengthens the connection between science, healthcare, and society. So to get into the team, today we're going to talk about advanced therapeutics, such as cell and gene therapies, which are among the most promising products of synthetic biology and engineering biology nowadays. Yet, alongside scientific promise comes questions about access, equity, and governance. Here, we say responsible innovation in advanced therapeutics, but who defines what responsible means? Regulators, scientists, patients, or investors? In your perspective, what is responsible innovation, Sophie and Marina?
Do you want me to start, Marina, or would you like to start?
Go first.
Okay. Well, hello, everybody. It's very nice to see you all. Personally, I think responsible innovation is sort of best, in my view, considered as a sort of an ethos or a mindset that's about taking care of the future through collective stewardship of science and innovation research practices and ecosystem in the present. And to me, what that means is asking hard questions, sort of not only what is possible, but what's desirable for society moving forward, and really reflecting on who gets to make the decisions about what we do, whose values are embedded into health innovations, who's marginalized, and what all that might mean for the futures we're shaping. That's the very short version, I think. Marina.
I mean, I could not say it better than that. I would just add the patient voice here, the patient perspective. So I think responsible innovation must come with the patient involved from the start and be at the heart of every innovation, because if we talk about innovation in health, it should be solution for patients, not solutions that, researchers or physicians think are good for patients. They should be here from the start and have their voice really listened to when developing innovation. And then equity and access will result also from this.
That was a strong start with such a concrete, rather philosophical question, but we are gonna go to the topic a bit more in more simple terms now. We have some time to do so it's nice. First, I would like to talk about who really benefits and who decides from this in this challenge. So first, one major concern is how decisions about research priorities and access are being made, and who benefits from them. So we have already talked about this responsible innovation, which is rather an abstract term, but I was wondering at what stage of research should responsibility enter the conversation? Discovery, like, will it already enter from the moment that we grant money to study a specific therapy, or at a later stage? What is your visions on that? And I don't know who wants to answer to that first?
Marina, shall I jump in first? Because I think I can probably give a theoretical and practical infused answer, and then you can follow in and give sort of the on-the-ground practice view of it, if that works for you. So the answer that I tend to give as a science technology studies academic is we need to think about responsibility as early as possible and all the time. And I'd always advise that we think about health innovations, I mean, sort of any innovation, but health innovations especially as more than technical. Obviously, there's a huge amount of technical work and expertise that goes into developing health innovations and advanced therapeutics, for example. But it's also about the social and political dimensions of what we're building, and those span the entire process. And if we think about responsible innovation as this stewardship of the futures we're building, it shouldn't necessarily be left to the end of the process, because a lot of the questions that we're asking, the decisions have already been made for. So asking questions at the very end of the sort of when products are built about who gets to benefit from these, we should be asking right at the beginning. We should be asking when we're making investment decisions and convening policy around what health priorities to focus on. These are the sorts of questions we should be asking there. So I think addressing sort of matters of responsibility is a continual and thoroughly embedded process. So as researchers, as I'm sort of assuming most of us are, I would be advocating we think about these right from when we're making technical design decisions, but recognizing that there are so many, we never start from a blank slate. There are so many decisions that have been made before ever we've received our projects. And to target responsible innovation, we need to be looking at those as well. But I also appreciate that practically on the ground, this is hard. Everybody has a lot of pressures on their time and focuses, and I think I'd probably like to hand over to Marina maybe to kind of elaborate a little bit more about kind of in practice what that looks like, because theoretically knowing something and having the capacity to implement it are two very different things.
Yeah, I agree. The theory and the practice are two different worlds. When it comes to involving patients, for example, it's often a discussion, and definitely this should come from the start, because they are the people who will benefit from the innovation at the end. And if you don't have them in the discussion at the beginning, then you may end up with an innovation that's great and maybe nobody will access to, or it will not be perfectly a good fit for patients. So at the end, it's a loss of time and loss of money and loss of energy. So having this patient view from the beginning, ensure that the solutions that are made for patients are really aligned with the patient expectations. And let me give you like one example. At FH Europe Foundation, we work with patients with a high cholesterol level, for example. And from a physician point of view, the goal is to reduce cholesterol deposit in the artery because it can lead to a heart attack. Of course, that's an important thing to do. But for patients, there are other things, because fat deposit, cholesterol deposit can also appear on their face. So it's quite difficult to manage this. And they also have fat deposit on the tendons, so mainly on the wrist, in the feet. So some patients, because of this fat deposit, they have to hide themselves, or they cannot even put shoes anymore, so they cannot walk. So having no cholesterol deposit in the heart, that's great, but nowhere in the body would be even better, because the quality of life is extremely important for this patient too. So that's why getting the patient's voice from the beginning is very important. And EUPathy developed a roadmap for patient involvement in research a few years ago, nearly 10 years ago now. And I think it's very, very useful tool where organization can check like where getting patient voice can be very useful to ensure that the innovation is going in the right way. So I would highly recommend looking at this roadmap.
I'm sorry, my internet got a bit slowed down, so I couldn't unmute myself. Yes, so it's indeed a tricky question, because of course the answer will always be the earlier the better, right? To already put this perspective in creating these therapies and already bringing into the conversation like, okay, if this therapy is really developed, how are we going to implement it, and how are we going to make sure that this reaches people? Because as we have seen in the previous seminar, this is really a bottleneck, right? That especially in the scientific community, you get very excited and very happy when some treatment is working, as Melissa was already describing. And then, yeah, it doesn't reach the public that it has to do. So I was wondering, because you already talk about this dichotomy of in theory and in practice, and then I would like to know your input about the current state. So do you think that currently are we incentivizing responsibility in academic and industrial science, or just speed and novelty? So are we taking this view into account enough, like the patient and more the translational part of it enough, or are we really just there to put the most novel and amazing treatment out there without really considering if this will be really reaching the people that needs to be reaching? And maybe Marina can pick it now, because I'm more of a patient address.
No problem. I think Sophie's point of view will be very interesting too, also on this part. Yeah, of course, we would like to have patients involved from the beginning. It's not always that easy, and also it's important to recognize that this patient must be fully equipped and educated to be able to really support the research and science, because we cannot ask anyone to help on a clinical trial design if they have no idea of how it works. So it also requires some education of the patient, and that's something we do at the foundation, and other organizations like UPATI, Eurodis are also giving certification to patients. So literacy will be very important, but I think we're seeing more and more involvement of patients from both on the private and the public side, because even in Geneva, in the hospital where so I live in Geneva, and even in the hospital, more and more research projects, they involve patient experts to have the patient voice, to have the patient point of view. So I think it's progressing. I cannot say like it's already perfect, but I think there's a huge progress made in that. And the goal is not to slow down research by having patients involved, but to really improve everything. So I don't think it's either speed and innovation, or either having the patient voice, but ideally having both of them.
I completely agree, Marina. You put it really nicely. There isn't a binary sort of either or to this. I think I actually think it's a great question to ask, because it opens a whole can of worms that give me 2 hours. I will talk about forever, but so I'll try and keep to some headline points. But I think there's sort of also no one answer to this, because different institutions take different approaches, and there's a lot of variance, especially across sectors. Obviously, we are health, but there's a lot of diversity within health and different approaches as well. But I think at a general level, our systems largely incentivize speed and novelty and demonstrable impact, possibly more effectively than they do responsibility. So I think, as Marina says, there's some great strides being made with kind of participation. But if you look at how research is funded and evaluated, there's some publication metrics, translation timelines, competitiveness, venture VC money investment, and those do very much tend to privilege rapid progress and scalability. And that's not to say that responsibility, as broadly understood, isn't being considered, but we're often assessing responsibility through the lens of one-time activities. So have we done our ethical approvals? Have we spoken to patients? Have we paid some consideration to potential consequences? And thinking of responsibility as a sort of an ongoing mindset and way in which we work, I think having different metrics would really help us that are more effective and challenge us to look at kind of care and equity and ongoing inclusion. Because as Marina has said as well about patient inclusion, one thing to note is there is no one archetypal patient. And when we're including patients, people are very different and have different requirements, and so one form of participation doesn't necessarily involve everybody. So having sort of multiple ways for patients to engage, I think, is really important. And I appreciate I've gone off the topic slightly, but in terms of incentives and metrics, I think we need to possibly pivot how we think about responsibility. And that will give us a better chance to be able to kind of measure things that are more meaningful and sustainable, I suppose. Marina, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
No, I fully agree. I just want to add that the important thing will be also to make sure that, for example, involving patient is not anymore a ticking box exercise. So it should, in terms of metric, it should be there, but it's not like, okay, at some point we had a patient coming to a board and listening to us, so we had a patient. No, it should be more than that. So it's important that it's not, as I said, a ticking box exercise. It should be a real involvement, and that's not easy to measure, that's for sure. But there are many initiatives coming. So I think there will be some more formal legal regulation around that, and it will help really have more responsible innovation at some point.
That's good, because I think all these things need to be considered and materially shape what counts as good science. And I think that's something that is just an ongoing sort of reshaping, as it were.
I mean, I come from a more academic background. I've always worked in academia, and I'm a PhD student right now. And I was just wondering, because, you know, grants, usually you do surveys, if you do any surveys, while you're doing your research, right? In the best case scenario, at least in my point of view, would be to do before you start the wet lab research. And as stupid as it sounds, IGEM does a very good job at this with the human practices, right? They make everyone like, no, you guys sit down, you think about the problem, and then go talk to people outside of the lab, and then come back and tell us how you changed your projects about it. It's a bit sad how, you know, it's a bit lost as you go in your academic career. At least that's my perspective. I don't see that happening during my PhD or even when I was working as a research assistant. That was not happening.
I think it's quite hard because the entire incentive structure is around, and there's a whole projectification of science as well. A lot of us are working on very short timelines. We have 18 months up to 3 years to deliver impact, however we care to decide what impact is. And there's a lot of competition for time and energy and attention. And there's this ongoing balance and struggle, I suppose, for trying to challenge yourself to continually do better and improve and include diverse perspectives, not just patients, but you know, different types of knowledges and civic communities who may not be patients. So sort of really diversifying the perspectives we take on, and that goes into our technical design. But then we also have our own careers to think about, and a lot of that is through, have you been publishing enough? And things like that. So the sort of the tensions and the stresses that are put on, especially early career researchers, it's hard to try and sustain the many plates at once.
Yeah, I mean, this is a bit off topic. Sorry, Sophia.
No,
but I do. It is important because it's indeed what Sophie was saying. Like, how do we measure the impact of research, and specifically also in the rare disease cases? But I'm happy to hear that this is also arising here, because in some of the conferences that I've been attending, I'm also a PhD candidate like Katarina, so early career. This is really coming up a lot. Like, these publication metrics are really a way to measure our impact. But I'm gonna come back to the topic of today. So we want to focus on rare diseases. And yeah, so one of the main problems of these therapeutics is that they are very expensive and they are not accessible to everyone. So I was wondering, how do we make sure that these therapies, when they reach the market, they are not limited to privileged population? And also, how do we balance these therapies being part of like a global market? And then how do we reach the patient, in a sense? All the patients, not only privileged patients. Yeah.
So I will start if you're okay. I think equity should be as a design principle, because if you wait till you have your product that's ready to be on the market to think about access, it's already too late. That you've already missed the opportunity. So it's not only about the price of the treatment. Of course, the price and the reimbursement are important, but if you have an amazing treatment that can be delivered in only one hospital per country, because the infrastructure is very heavy, it will not be accessible to many people at the end. So it's not only about the price. There's many things to be taken into account when you want to have an innovation that's accessible. So this should be something researchers should think about this before, because when the innovation is ready to be on the market, the opportunity is missed, can be missed.
I completely second that, and certainly when we're talking about kind of cell and gene therapies, and I'm sure we'll talk about manufacturing and distribution in a bit, but certainly with cell and gene therapies, and you think about all the sort of the new requirements around the cold chain that we need to manage, and this sort of introduces extra cost, and also the challenges. I'm just thinking specifically about something like Casgevy for sickle cell disease. And, this is a really grueling therapy, and understanding kind of the whole life cycle of this therapy for the patients especially, and sort of factoring that into the technical design decisions that get made. And obviously it's an amazing therapy, but sort of another way to think about it is there's a whole portfolio of treatments here. There isn't a one-size-fits-all treatment for people. And when we're thinking about access and equity, there are also questions of kind of suitability and applicability of treatments to people's particular pathologies, but also their own, what they value and their own life experiences. And so I think sort of access is very linked to equity and linked to technical design, but there are also other matters of equity around who's getting to be involved in the innovation processes as well. So there's equity of access, but there's also equity in innovation as well. And I think if we look to include more diverse voices and sort of a lot of low to middle income countries in the innovation of some of these cell and gene therapies for rare diseases, I think we'll start to see some different models coming out that perhaps will address some of these access issues. So that's just something else to add.
Yeah, fully agree that diversity in the clinical trials, for example, will also help having more access later on. I think it will support that.
This is the perfect answer to this question, because we're about to get into equity, cost, and access. And as a lot of people in this session are aware, these therapies are extremely expensive, just like Melissa talked about in the previous session. And my question was, maybe Marina has more practical experience on this, but what is a practical pathway for equitable access when it comes to these therapies? And have you guys seen any good example when equity was taken very seriously in the development of these therapies, where that aided that design?
It's a very interesting question, but not an easy one. I could not say that there's one pathway that works and that's it. I would love to be able to say that. I could just say that there are a lot of initiatives going on to make access and equitable access to care, particularly in Europe. So over the past years, we had the UN resolution on rare diseases, and last year the WHO resolution on rare diseases, and both really focus on access. It's key topic. So I think initiatives like that will really kind of push for this access to treatment for people living with rare diseases, and they will probably act as blueprints and help more at the international, local levels having this implemented, because also even in Europe, disparity in Europe is also huge. I mean, and also in the European Union, health policy depends on member states. There are competencies on member states. So each member state will decide the health policy. So even if there's a decision at the EU level, they are still the decision maker for their country. So I hope these really big international initiatives from the WHO and the UN will really push for implementation of frameworks that will really support access and equitable access to care.
I think that's a great answer. I think some of the examples I have are predominantly around manufacturing and distribution. I think obviously sort of creating technologies, it doesn't matter if we can't manufacture them and get them to people in a sensible fashion. And in the UK, certainly we've been looking at, and we've in the summer in 2025 last year, passed some sort of almost anticipatory regulatory frameworks that enable certain classifications of cell and gene therapies, especially for monogenic rare diseases, to be kind of classified differently, to enable them not to be centralized manufacturer, which is our traditional model of manufacturing, kind of big pharma style, but to be point of care manufacturing. So in hospitals that have capabilities to manufacture personalized medicines directly there in the hospitals. Also modular manufacturing, so these sort of kind of units that sit close to hospitals, not in a big centralized place, that can also move around. And I think there's a big link, because a lot of the cost of the therapies are tied with all the institutional structures and infrastructure that goes into delivering them. So if we look at different models of manufacture and distribution, that can radically bring the price down. And I didn't get a chance to fact check myself here, but anecdotally, I believe that it's somewhere in Spain managed to get a cell and gene therapy down. I think it might have been CAR T therapy, taking a more modular approach to manufacture, brought costs of hundreds of thousands of euros down to about 85,000. Please don't quote me on that. That needs a fact check. But people are trying to look at different ways to redistribute all the infrastructure and institutional arrangements around it. So I think that's not necessarily successful, but it's certainly a place of experimentation that could yield useful results.
Yeah, and if I may add, I think with innovation and progress, if you remember, like years ago, having like the whole genome analysis was absolutely crazy and used to cost a lot. And now it's something very basic at the end, and it's not that expensive. Yeah. So I think also with time, some innovation will be less expensive because it's gonna get more common. It's usually when it comes that it's very expensive, but then you improve it and it gets more accessible, I would say.
Yeah, and I think it would be a dereliction of my duty as an STS academic not to point out that a lot of costing is a political decision, and obviously costing relates to equity and access, and it is possible to subsidize some of these medicines, and so that is also a political decision that is not being made, but could be being made. So as well as looking at sort of the technology systems themselves, we should be looking at government strategies and policies around what they can do here as well.
You already have replied to my next question, which was what models or policies show promise in reducing the cost barriers. And I was going to ask, because I'm assuming these technologies are developed by pharmaceutical companies because they're already so expensive to make that only big companies usually have the monopoly to do these kinds of R&D decisions. And I was going to ask how easily it is for them to collaborate with the government, to have access to the hospitals that you mentioned and things like that. Is it something that happens regularly?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I think my internet connection cut out.
You talked about these technologies being manufactured on site in like hospitals that have the facilities to do so. Are these partnerships between pharmaceutical companies and I'm assuming the public healthcare system of the country, are these partnerships happening or regularly?
So the ones I'm talking about, I would say they're not happening because the regulatory systems are not yet in place. But in the UK as of 2025. I believe some places in Europe are slightly ahead of the UK. I can't comment on that necessarily, but there are constraints around which hospitals and clinics, for example, would be able to do this. And they're often the big research-heavy institutions. We're not talking about your local community hospital. We are talking about big, powerful, rich institutions that have a very rich research culture, cutting-edge technologies. So although it is a fantastic option that hopefully is going to be explored more, there is no getting away from the fact that we are still concentrating power in a small number of institutions, research-heavy hospital kind of teaching hospitals and research hospitals. Marina, I don't know if you want to add a more European perspective on this.
Yeah, I think what you refer to are the kind of, I think they're called homebrew drugs. And I think it's usually, I'm not sure pharmaceutical companies are really huge fans of this. And sometimes they are also criticizing, I think, the quality requirements that are behind these, because they're not exactly the same that apply to pharmaceutical company. But I think there could be more private-public partnerships, definitely. And I think, as we mentioned, pricing transparency is something that we still don't have, and that people are asking for to know, okay, what's really behind the price, and that's something that's difficult to see, and that's also some kind of political issue here. But I see that public and private partnerships could really be delivering more. And an example is during COVID pandemic. I think the collaborations were amazing, and it was the first time we've seen like that kind of collaboration, and the science moved so quickly because with that. So I think, when there's a will, there's a way. So there are possibilities, but I think there are some barriers here and there, and probably money is one of them.
And also kind of political power. The big pharmaceuticals, they are not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily benefit them to distribute and decentralize, because they do have a monopoly, and they've done very well at what they do. But
some food for thought next time you vote. So since you guys mentioned COVID as well, this was even more apparent to people that are not necessarily working in a wet lab, I would say. How do we ensure that these therapies are accessible to low and middle income countries when they don't have the manufacturing capabilities to deliver these therapies most of the time?
Sophie, do you wanna go?
I will start. I may give a usual STS, it depends comment, but I think there are different models. I think we absolutely need to look at where and how therapies are developed, obviously, and sort of how that stacks up in relation to instance of rare diseases. And obviously what is rare disease in one country isn't necessarily rare disease in another. We need to kind of be mindful of that. And if we can decentralize manufacturing and production, especially, as well as the sort of the core research ahead of that, and put power into localized communities, I think that's a good start. But that said, it's not a panacea, because there's lots of social and political organization that needs to happen for this to work. And with the price of raw materials, feedstocks, everything along those lines, we need to be quite cautious that we don't end up creating a two-tier system, I think. And I think there are also some very thorny and complex issues about decolonizing health research in general, because especially with kind of public-private partnerships and cross-national partnerships, the global north and high-income countries, there's the money, and then sort of the investment is still coming from people who have perpetuated and still perpetuating historical and present harms. And so, yes, in trying to lift everybody's kind of health innovation landscapes, we need to be very, very cognizant of the fact that we don't carry on harms in a different shape. And before I hand over to Marina, I think there are some wonderful initiatives that do actually give a bit of hope. I don't know if anybody here is from Cambridge University, but they have this great sort of innovation where they were having some challenges with just getting reliable reagents and sort of feedstocks into their labs. And so they set about addressing that, and they realized that this is a global problem that affected not only high-income countries, but low to middle-income countries as well. And what I think is really lovely about that is they spun out this company that addresses a systemic problem, and everybody benefits as a result. So I think there's some really interesting initiatives that can give hope that, you know, we're just not perpetuating the old colonial stereotypes and harms. So Marina, I'll hand over to you.
No, I fully agree that the goal is not to have this approach, and it's not same. It's not an easy question, because having if we have, for example, all the clinical trials happening in low and middle income countries, then we will have the issue for the other population. So I think it should be a nice balance. But it's not that easy to find, particularly when we talk about rare diseases. If we talk about diseases with, I don't know, like a few thousand of patients all around the world living with this condition, then it's a very different challenge compared to COVID, where we had like millions of people being contaminated at the same time. So challenges are, it's not only on the localization, but rare disease itself make it a huge challenge when it comes to that.
And I think that's a really important point to make. And anytime I gloss over that, please, Marina, hold me to account, because that is ultimately at the heart of what we're getting to, because it's doubly hard. I mean, exponentially harder for rare diseases that don't have the huge investment in money and attention.
And I will, at this point, would like to go a bit forward this conversation towards regulation and governance, which has already been touched upon. So just to address some questions that I'm interested in. And you already discussed this switch of paradigm in the manufacturing, right? From these big biopharma companies that have these big fermenters with the same, like a big production of a reagent or a treatment, to this on-spot manufacturing treatment, which would be very beneficial in the case of rare diseases, or more personalized medicine, as also very trendy word right now. So I was wondering, because these two things, in my point of view, they should have like a different regulatory framework. So I was, in the case of the European Union or also the UK, do you know if there are any regulatory bodies equipped to handle these highly personalized therapies, like the gene therapy, or if there is a willingness, a political willingness to create these kind of regulatory bodies that address the problem specifically to this small manufacturer type of, maybe Sophie?
Yeah, for the manufacturing part, I definitely let Sophie answer. You're the expert.
Oof, well, I'm unclear in the EU, to be honest. I think certainly in the UK there is appetite. I mean, the regulations, there was a sort of an anticipatory regulation, and I think it was called POCAR, P-O-C-A-R, if anybody wants to Google it, in the UK in 2025, which effectively enables people to experiment with this type of manufacture. So I think there is an appetite. It's a huge shift and requires so many other institutional and social structures and systems So, for example, point-of-care manufacturing for these sort of, I think, Marina, you called them on-brew medicines, which could be very beneficial for targeted kind of rare disease therapies. They put a huge burden on existing healthcare facilities and sort of practitioners to be able to change their workflows. And in the US, not that I want to talk about the US, but there was a lot of research done about this type of delivery mechanism, and they found actually the kind of the knowledge infrastructures and upskilling clinicians to work out when it was appropriate to be offering these was a huge barrier to access. So I think, yes, there's an appetite to explore, but how much further forward that gets us without kind of some big additional follow-on support and investment to change kind of hospital practices and better fund hospitals to accommodate these sorts of changes, I don't think, in my opinion, it will get very far.
Yeah. So not focusing on the manufacturing part of it, but more on the regulation around these kind of projects. I would say that there's also an appetite in Europe, and whether it's for rare disease or for personalized medicine, which is getting more and more importance. There's definitely an appetite for that, and there was the Biotech Act in December that's mentioning that it's just the version 1, and I think version 2 should come this year. So with more details, and also the pharma package with some changes also mentioned. So there's a lot going on, but at the same time, it's clear that science is going faster than regulation. It's always been like that. And also because regulation, usually they want long-term data to make decisions. So there are things that cannot be done as fast. So yeah, and the time to get a consensus when it's a European level, the time to get a consensus of the member states, etc., all of these take a lot of time. So I think, yes, there's a will to progress in this direction, but there will be some years before we have a clear frameworks.
Agreed. And I think you've raised a really important point, because regulation is often retrospective and it doesn't catch up quickly enough. And so there is a sort of, you've used the term governance. And so there is a difference between retrospective regulation and governance sort of more broadly, which is having the systems and checks and balances in place to be able to shape the research in a way that is beneficial for society. I'll stick a pin in who gets to decide what that is. So certainly in the UK and in Europe, with a lot of the European funders that I work with, there is this move away from just regulatory top-down control to anticipatory governance that is throughout the innovation life cycle. And that takes a whole different array of things. So, for example, just trying to think of some examples, sort of life cycle assessments as well of technologies, and kind of foresight approaches of, okay, well, we can never predict the future, but how can we start to anticipate plausible futures that may generate from the technologies that we put out there and how people take them up. So having sort of a more agile ecosystem of checks and balances that is run through every stage, including our laboratory-based research stages for creating therapies for rare diseases and things, I think is really important. And I do see that shift, albeit slowly, but there is a shift recognizing that is probably what's required.
Two great points. The first thing I want to add is we're going to have a Q&A Biotech Act on biomanufacturing in the summer. So stay tuned for that if you have any questions. We're going to have policy experts from the European Union. So that's going to be very exciting. The second point that I want to add is that if you're interested in any of these policy conversations in SynBio and how these frameworks are starting to be made, especially in America mostly, there are a series of seminars by the Rice University where experts from the university talk about these controlled release things. They are not to do with therapies, just to be clear. They're more for like bioremediation and things like that. But if you guys are interested, they're very approachable, so feel free. They're on our newsletter. But to go back on the topic, now going a bit towards like the communication of the science when it comes to these therapies, and how they are communicated to the public in general. They are most oftentimes presented to the public as these wonder therapies. Nobody understands really how they work, and they are miraculous in the eyes of the people that are not involved in wet lab research, or even in research in general. And my question is, how can science and the communicators from the institutions involved in the development of these therapies engage with the public and get the public's trust on science, which is a big problem nowadays, but also avoid unrealistic expectations when it comes to the therapies? Because as we saw with Melissa's talk, these therapies do help, but most of the time they don't cure people completely from their condition.
I can start. Communication is my thing. That's something I do every day. I think, yeah, it's very important to communicate about this innovation, but being over-promising is not a good thing, definitely not. And I think usually research institutions, they are quite fair, they are quite balanced in what they share. Sometimes it's the media that's making a lot of noise around something and then going a bit too far about the promises behind a drug just to make the buzz or something like that. And it's not appropriate when it comes to research and to patient giving hope when it's not that huge. It's not great at all. So I think and when it comes from investors or pharma companies, there are rules and regulations, so they cannot also share like overpromise on the results of a drug. So I think it's very important the way we communicate with the lay audience and with patients, and we need to adapt the language, because sometimes institutions there will share the results, but it's still very scientific and not really. I mean, it's also a question of access, but access to the information, because sometimes it's very difficult to understand for people that are not scientists themselves. So that's also something with the foundation we're doing a lot. It's also educating patients on their disease and be able to understand more and be able to discuss with researchers, with physicians, and with policymakers on topics. So I think this is an important part. And for institutions, the most important thing is transparency. I think it's always the best. Transparency and trust will come with time. That's the only way.
I absolutely second that, because kind of from a sociological perspective, a lot of trust is less about the research, not always, but and often about the institutions themselves and how they conduct themselves and how transparent they are. And I think there's a lot to be said about being open and honest and as transparent as is possible. Obviously, you can't necessarily lay all the skeletons bare, but that openness or commitment to openness, I think, is really important. And I think also it's important to kind of recognize that communication, I mean, you kind of mentioned it there, Marina, but communication is not something that we can lay on the scientific community alone. Because again, going back to the institutional structures in which we work, kind of big impact. Sort of, there are big expectations around what we do. There's big promises made by research institutions, and we're in this sort of the cycle of promising and the expectations that come with that, and then demonstrating impact as a result. So, although it's galling to hear sometimes, the whole institutional structures need to change to be able to support people for responsible communication. And absolutely, we should be starting by being open and honest and transparent and being thoughtful about our language and communicating in the right way. But that's part of the puzzle that really needs to be supported by bigger institutional structures.
Yeah, no, yeah, completely agree. Just our last question before the Q&A. I want to tie this conversation not just about rare diseases therapies, but other therapies as well. For example, COVID. We saw a lot of mixed reactions about how quick the vaccine came out and things like that. Why do you think that some therapies get so much hype and others get shut down by the public so quickly with misinformation and things like that? What changes amongst like these reactions? Is there anything that you think that the scientists should be improving on, or people in the whole infrastructure of the manufacturing that are not just the scientists?
I think the big issue we had during COVID is that everybody was become an expert in something. And I was surprised to have like that many experts in epidemiology and virology around me at this time. So I think everybody can claim being an expert online right now. And this also comes with education and literacy. People, if they're more educated, to find the right sources, to be able to read an article or to understand what's behind and see what looks like more promotional thing and what's more solid in terms of science, will also help identifying what are the key resources and what are just fake news or buzz or whatever. So I think people education, literacy is very important in this field.
And I think to add to that as well, specifically the difference between, you know, the excitement and the fear, those kind of different poles, it kind of connects to this, how people sociologically relate to risk, because it's very easy to think, oh, risk is something you can calculate, for example. But that's not the case. There are so many interesting studies about our perceptions of risk. I mean, the classic example is people are more afraid to fly normally than they are to drive, and yet the risk perception. And so it always deals with kind of your own knowledges and your own experiences. And so it's a really complex landscape that we're communicating within. And also excitement and fear are not the properties of the technologies themselves, but how they're shaped in the cultural imagination. And I think that's often the ones that are shaped with this huge dynamic curative power. People do get excited about. I get excited about it, and I should know better. But there are equally others, do you know, kind of that touch on human germline editing that become very contentious. And so I think the framing has a lot to do with it as well. And I'll second Marina. I was staggered by how many people ended up being a COVID expert. But again, there's something very sociological about that. It's not about the science or the technology. It's about some sort of semblance of control and your relationship to what's going on in the world. And I think that's really interesting. And to kind of bring that back to the patient perspective, it's why the patient perspective is so important, especially in rare diseases, because that experiential knowledge and expertise is so vital into understanding how therapies are going to be received, I think.
Yeah, I fully agree. And definitely the cultural aspect is very important for the way people react to some innovation and others. When I say cultural, it's really like based on the country or the religion, on everything that will impact the perception you have on an innovation, particularly when it comes to health, and if it's gene editing or these kind of things, it can really touch more than just the science. Like, but it gets more.
And I think that makes it hard to grapple with, but it also makes it really interesting, because then you start to look at it and go, well, this is no longer just a technical problem. This is not about the technology. This is about the technology and the futures we're building in the society. And ultimately, to bring it back to responsible innovation, the question at the beginning, it's kind of how all that connects. We should be looking into how all that connects, because it makes us better researchers.
Sorry, I'm going to stop you right now. And I think this is a very interesting topic, and I'm going to retain myself to give some samples that I've been encountering lately that I think are really related to this, but maybe later. Because now we want to move on to the Q&A, because we have been a bit over the time, but that's perfectly fine, because a lot of interesting things have been discussed. We do have some more concrete and interesting questions in the chat. So I'm going to ask the first one. How do we balance hope with informed consent when families may see a trial as their only option? And yeah, maybe Marina has a bit more experience on this.
I think that's a difficult one, because it's very personal. It's every patient family will react differently. to an innovation, same based on their cultural background, education, religion, the countries they live in. So it's very difficult to give insights on this, and also patient point of view can evolve over time, and depending on how the disease progresses and the kind of disease. If it's a disease that's if it's something that's life threatening for your kid, like we saw just before with SLA, it's very different than a chronic disease that will evolve on the next 40 years, and where you don't have too much symptoms. So I think it's very difficult to draw a line here and to see, like, really, I think there's a lot of things to take into consideration, and the way things will be explained to patients is critical, particularly for explaining to families what everything that entails the innovation, what the pros and cons, but giving them all the information is crucial, so that they can have a real decision. It's a shared decision-making process, and they need to be fully informed.
I agree. I don't think I've got much to add necessarily, but I think it's also about having frank and open conversations about uncertainty, because there are absolutely no guarantees. Even with the best therapies in the world, there are no guarantees, and those conversations will look very different dependent on disease. I see the follow-up question is pediatric patients, and that's that's another thorny issue of how we ethically include pediatric patients when long-term risks of advanced therapeutics are still unknown, and that's kind of a subcase of the first question, I guess. Marina, you may be able to speak to pediatric patients better than I can, but
for pediatric it's even more difficult, because parents have to make a choice, to make a decision. So and sometimes without knowing the long-term potential consequences. So that's a very, very difficult decision to take for the family. But that's each case is different. There are too many factors that come together, so it's difficult.
Agreed. And I think there's a question, I don't have a definitive answer, but I certainly think a question we should be asking is how we distribute the responsibility for making that decision. Because obviously some of it is regulation, some of it is governance structures, some of it is how do we manage uncertainty and react to uncertainty as a society or as a rare disease community. So there are so many different layers and tiers of places where that responsibility can be worked through, so it doesn't all fall to the individual patient as well. So I think that's what that looks like. I don't know. I'm a little out of my comfort zone, but yeah,
and I think that really reflects how difficult it is to discuss about this, because it's really like case specific, but at the same time we also need to create like a common guidelines to certain cases,
and also sorry to interrupt, but rare diseases, some are rare but kind of common, if I may, because it starts from 1 out of 2,000. So at the end, it can be quite a lot of people. But with the foundation, we also work on a condition called FCS, which is familial chylomicronemia syndrome, and it's 1 in a million. So also for these patients to have the possibility to have some feedback and discussions with other patients, it's extremely difficult. So sometimes you can discuss with other families and have feedbacks from other patients, but sometimes for rare disease you cannot. So that makes it even more difficult for these people to take a decision.
Indeed. We are already a bit over time, but if there is any pressing questions from the audience, I will like to give like a final opportunity to do it. You can also just say it out loud.
In the meantime, in case someone is writing in the chat, Sophie and Marina, if you have anything you want to add to the discussion generally, we have learned a lot from you today, especially me about the biomanufacturing aspect. I never thought about it before. So if you have anything else to add at the end, like as a conclusion note, I give the floor to you now, if anyone is writing in the chat.
I would just add that I mean, responsible innovation comes with discussion with patients, and particularly for rare disease, because they have this expertise that maybe no one else has. So it's important to listen to them, and it's nice to see that things are moving in the right direction, even though it takes time. But like innovation, things take time. But we're kind of optimistic.
I sort of wish I'd gone first now, because that would have been a lovely way to end. But I second all of that. I mean, your expertise is great, Marina. I think for me, thinking of responsible innovation very expansively, and not just responsible innovation, but just research and innovation and what we all do very expansively. It is not just technical, it is more than technical. It's social values, it's belief systems and structures, it's regulatory frameworks, it's governance practices, it's institutional readiness. There are all of these things that go into making a responsible health innovation ecosystem, and it's very important to recognize that, and the different expertises and knowledges, especially in rare diseases, as Marina said, I think is critical, because these are the people who understand what it's like to have these diseases best. And I think science and research, our research, benefits drastically from just incorporating these voices, full stop. So that should be a non-negotiable. And I think, just as a note for us, and assuming people on this call are researchers, is a lot, as I said earlier, a lot of responsibility is put on individual researchers when it is kind of broader institutional structures that make it very difficult. So I think being kind to ourselves and doing what we can in our own research practices is a hard balance to strike. I think we should absolutely be striving to try and make change and incorporate diverse perspectives and pluralism and different solutions and thinking outside the box and asking if we can do things differently. But you also have your own careers to look after as well. So just try and find a balance that works for you, push for what you can do, and recognize that this isn't just on your shoulders. So I think that's the other message from this.
That's a great one.
Yeah, that's a great way to finish, especially because our society is completely run by volunteers, and we're all doing our own full-time jobs, but we just do this on the side. So yeah, that is something that we try to do in our society. And I hope people here in the audience also take that for their own careers and volunteer positions and things like that. So since there are no more questions in the chat, thank you so much for both of you for joining. Yeah, we have learned a lot from you, and thank you for this amazing discussion, because we don't have that many seminars on like the social dimensions of research. So we're really trying to push these forward more. Yeah, so thank you, and stay tuned for next month's seminar. It's going to be posted soon, next week.
Thank you. And thank you to you as well for hosting these, because this is how we start a conversation. So thank you very much for having us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you, both of you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.